My aunt was childless, and to fill this void in her life and save her marriage, she did what many Eastern women often do. She emotionally blackmailed her elder sister in the name of love and asked for me right after my birth. Her in-laws tortured her, and her husband, desperate for a child, wanted to marry another woman. My aunt believed that the only way to save her marriage was to adopt me. After all, I was my parents' fourth daughter, with 3 elder sisters already, so she thought my mother would not refuse. But to her surprise, my mother firmly declined, saying, "I cannot give my daughter to anyone. It's too difficult for me." Hearing this, my aunt broke down in tears. She sat at my mother's feet, begging her, "For God's sake, please give me Tabassum. Otherwise, my home will be destroyed." But my mother hardened her heart. The love for her child overpowered her love for her sister. She said clearly, "Look, Sakina, I cannot distance myself from my daughter just to save your home. If you want to adopt a child, you can take one from an orphanage." But my aunt refused, saying, "My husband will never agree to this. He does not want to adopt a child from an orphanage." Despite her persistent pleas, my mother stood firm, and so for a few more years my aunt remained childless, enduring the taunts of her in-laws and struggling to stop her husband from marrying another woman. Then fate took a turn. I was only 7 years old when my father passed away. Our circumstances became dire, and we faced days of hunger. My mother was left alone in this world with her 4 daughters. She had no source of income and no way to feed us. I was the youngest, and my mother worried the most about me. One day, my aunt visited us and said, "If you had given Tabassum to me back then, her life would have been so much better. But you broke my trust." Saying this, she began to cry. My aunt was still childless and continued to endure the scorn of her in-laws. She had barely managed to stop her husband from marrying another woman, but it seemed like only a matter of time before he would. When my mother saw my aunt crying and looked at the condition of our home, she said, "Sakina, I don't want to, but circumstances are such that I cannot keep Tabassum here anymore. My 3 older daughters are on the brink of adulthood. I'll somehow manage to get them married, but Tabassum is still too young. Take her with you." At the age of 7, my mother handed me over to my aunt, saying she could no longer take responsibility for me. My aunt, overjoyed, held my hand tightly. All she cared about was having a child. It didn't matter to her that I was already 7 years old. I cried at my mother's feet, begging her not to give me away to my aunt. "If you can keep my 3 elder sisters, why can't you keep me?" I asked. But my mother explained, "They are growing up, and I'll get them married. But I cannot take care of you anymore." My older sisters had already started working in other people's homes as cleaners to make ends meet. I, however, was too young to work and was nothing more than a burden. Despite my relentless protests, my mother packed my belongings and handed me over to my aunt. In anger, I told my mother, "From today, I have no connection with you. I will never come back to this house." My mother looked at me with a heavy heart, but I ignored her and crossed the threshold of my home, holding my aunt's hand. I swore to myself that I would never return to my mother's house again. I had always thought my mother was a cruel woman. She had kept my older sisters close to her heart, but had cast me out of our home. If she could care for them, why not me? My heart was filled with bitterness toward her, and over time, my aunt only fueled that hatred. She would tell me, "Your mother never loved you. If she did, she wouldn't have sent you away in difficult times. She kept your older sisters because they were beautiful. But you, she didn't want you because you weren't like them." My aunt was a peculiar woman. She didn't truly want a child for the joy of motherhood. She only wanted me to show her in-laws that she had a child. In truth, she neither desired a child nor accepted me as one. Instead, I became a means to fill the emptiness of their home and a token to silence the taunts of her in-laws. There was no bond of the heart between us. My aunt made me do every chore around the house. She would watch television all day while I worked tirelessly. In exchange for 3 meals a day, I had to endure endless work. I would often cry silently while completing the chores. Sometimes I would be angry at my mother and think, even if we were starving, she could have kept me at home. At least I wouldn't have become a servant in my aunt's house. Life continued in this way. By the time I turned 14, I had spent 7 years in my aunt's home without ever looking back toward my own. I hadn't visited my mother, and she hadn't come to see me either. Perhaps she had moved on with her life without me. My aunt and mother had no connection anymore. In fact, my aunt and uncle had even moved to a new house, far away from where we used to live. Living with my aunt and uncle was incredibly difficult. The two of them never got along. My uncle seemed to have an affair with another woman and would often stay out all night. When he returned in the morning, my aunt would erupt into furious arguments with him. The house was filled with constant fights. My uncle's flirtatious nature disgusted me. He often made me uncomfortable, sometimes watching inappropriate movies on TV, singing strange songs, or looking at me in unsettling ways. One morning, after staying out all night, my uncle returned home smelling of a woman's perfume. This enraged my aunt, and their argument escalated to a new level. The fight was so intense that all of a sudden, my aunt collapsed. We later learned she had suffered a heart attack. Within a week, she passed away. My aunt's death was a devastating blow to me. Somewhere deep down, I had come to see her as a mother figure. After her death, I was left alone with my uncle, and living under the same roof as him became unbearable. Without my aunt as a buffer, his presence terrified me. As night fell, an inexplicable fear would take over. His nature had always seemed strange to me, constantly smoking, giving me unsettling looks, and finding excuses to come into the kitchen when I was there. Even when my aunt was alive, I had sensed his uneasiness around me. But now in this empty house, it was impossible to stay. I felt like a thief living in my aunt's house. As evening approached, I would lock myself in my room, trying to stay invisible. Whenever he entered the room, I would retreat to a corner, trying to vanish from his sight. But how long could I avoid him? One day, my uncle finally spoke to me. "Get ready, Tabassum. I'm taking you to your mother's house," my uncle said one day. Hearing this, a wave of relief washed over me. I thought I would finally be able to stay with my mother. No matter how much resentment I held toward her, I knew that at least with her, I wouldn't have to fear for my dignity. I was growing up, beginning to understand right from wrong, and it was clear to me that my uncle's intentions were far from pure. So when he offered to take me to my mother, I agreed without hesitation. He put me in a car and we set off toward a faraway area. After a long drive, we arrived at a place that left me confused. This wasn't my neighborhood. I asked him about it, and he said, "Your mother left that house long ago. She's become very wealthy now." His words puzzled me, and I couldn't understand how my mother could have become so rich. The car stopped in front of a massive mansion. As we entered, I saw a woman sitting inside. My uncle greeted her, took a betel leaf from her hand, and said, "See, I told you I'd bring a beautiful bird. Tabassum is all yours now. Now give me my payment." He laughed loudly like some kind of demon and continued, "When her aunt was alive, she kept a tight watch on her. But now that she's gone, this little bird has fallen into my hands." The woman handed my uncle a thick wad of cash while I stood there in shock, unable to process what was happening. I finally asked, "Uncle, where is my mother? What's going on?" He smirked and said, "Your mother and sisters are dead. They passed away together in an accident. Now this woman is your mother. Consider her your family." The woman stepped forward, forcefully hugging me, and said, "From now on, I am your mother. Don't worry, Tabassum. I'll take great care of you. You'll have to live here as my daughter." The overpowering scent of her perfume made me dizzy. The place felt strange, almost sinister. The walls were covered with obscene paintings, large curtains hung everywhere, and in one corner there was a platform that looked like a stage. I had never seen a house like this before. The woman's sari, her jewelry, her heavy makeup. It was all overwhelming and unnerving. I felt suffocated in her arms, but she held me tightly, as though she cared deeply for me. My uncle, meanwhile, quietly slipped out of the house. I screamed and called out for him, but he didn't turn back. I struggled and cried in the woman's arms, desperate to escape this place, to free myself from her hold. But instead of letting me go, she slapped me hard across the face and yelled, "I am trying to be your mother, and you're creating a scene. Know your place. I bought you for thousands of rupees. You belong to me now." With that, she shoved me toward another woman. But when I looked at the second woman, My heart sank. She looked more like a man than a woman, tall, broad, and dark-skinned, with large, piercing eyes that stared me down. She grabbed me by my hair and dragged me further into the mansion. She threw a red sari at me and barked, "Put this on and get ready. I'll teach you how to present yourself to the customers tonight." Tears streaming down my face, I refused, sobbing that I wouldn't do it. Her response was to step forward and strip me of my clothes, ignoring my cries and protests. She forcefully wrapped the sari around me with her own hands, leaving me utterly helpless and terrified. I was so humiliated that I wished the earth would swallow me whole. I tried to cover myself with my arms, but that woman seemed completely unaffected by my shame. She dressed me in heavy jewelry, placed large earrings in my ears, and began teaching me how to seduce, how to dance, and how to behave. But I couldn't stop crying. When she realized I wasn't going to submit easily, she lost her temper and beat me mercilessly. However, she was careful not to touch my face, ensuring it remained unscathed. Instead, she bruised the rest of my body and then threatened, "If you don't perform, I'll rub salt and chili powder into these wounds." Terrified, I gave in to her demands. Over the next few days, she taught me how to dance, move, and behave in ways that made me sick to my core. On the fifth day, she announced, "Tonight, you'll be part of the mansion's gathering." Hearing this, I felt like my soul had left my body. I was helpless and completely at her mercy. That evening, she forced me into the gathering. The room was filled with men, their eyes devouring me from head to toe. Their lust was unmistakable, and it sent chills down my spine. I was so terrified of their leering gazes that I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The woman who had enslaved me forced me to dance in front of them. I danced with tears streaming down my face, barely able to hold myself together. Once the dance was over, she threw a bucket of water over me, soaking me completely. Then she began auctioning me off to the highest bidder. Shivering from the cold and drenched in water, I stood there humiliated and exposed. My semi-bare body was on display, and I felt utterly powerless. Yet to my surprise, not a single man placed a bid on me. Despite my youth and beauty, no one bought me. The other girls, who were also part of the gathering, had been sold. Their customers had already taken them to their respective rooms. But I remained standing there, feeling exposed and vulnerable, while the room emptied out. The woman who owned the mansion, whom everyone called Madam, was visibly stunned. She couldn't believe that no one had shown interest in me. Madam stared at me in disbelief. "How is this possible?" she muttered to herself. "You've grown into a beautiful young woman. You're no longer the weak and dark-skinned girl you once were. You've blossomed into something extraordinary, and yet no one has placed a bid on you. I paid a hefty price for you because I knew you would bring in even more. But now you've proven to be worthless." Her words cut through me like a knife. Madam called me over and demanded, "What game are you playing? What did you do to make the customers avoid you?" I shook my head, tears in my eyes, and whispered, "I don't know. I have no idea." Madam's anger boiled over. She turned to one of her aides, Dordana, and shouted, "Take her to her room and lock her up. Tomorrow I want her dressed even better than today. I paid a fortune for her, and now she's turning out to be trash. I thought I was buying a diamond, but I ended up with coal." Madam stormed off, angrily puffing on her cigarette, blowing smoke into the air as if to release her frustration. Dordana grabbed me by the arm and dragged me to my room. Even she seemed shocked and confused. "Tell me the truth, Tabassum," she said. "Why didn't any of the customers look at you? You were the most beautiful and desirable girl in the entire gathering. We thought men would fight over you, but what happened tonight has left both me and Madam baffled." I repeated to her what I had told Madam. "I don't know. I truly don't." And that was the truth. I had no idea why things had turned out the way they did. The next day, the same routine played out. Dordana dressed me up even more elaborately than before, and once again forced me to stand semi-bare in front of the customers. Yet no one bought me. Other women found customers. Other girls were sold, but I returned to my room untouched. Strangely enough, this brought me relief. Despite living in this brothel, my dignity remained intact. It was still safe. Days turned into weeks, and although no one placed a bid on me, I was content knowing my honor remained unblemished. The madam, however, began to despise me. She saw me as a worthless investment, a failed venture that cost her money and reputation. Still, every night, she would dress me up and parade me in the gatherings, hoping someone, someday, would buy me so she could recover her losses. And then, one day, it finally happened. By then, I had been at the brothel for nearly 2 months. I had grown accustomed to the belief that no one would ever purchase me. I walked into the gatherings without fear, confident that my dignity would remain protected. But that night, a cold, dark night, things took a sinister turn. It was freezing, and I was brought into the gathering dressed in barely anything. A bucket of cold water was thrown over me, leaving me shivering violently. My body was exposed, my beauty fully on display. For the first time, a man placed a bid on me. But unlike the others, he didn't want me for just one night. He wanted to buy me forever. To the madam, I was a liability, a failed gamble. So when this man offered to buy me outright, she immediately turned to Durdana and said, "Sell her. At least we'll get our money back." And just like that, without my consent, I was sold. Durdana dragged me to my room, furious. "Pack your things and get out of here forever," she spat. "I wasted so much time on you, but you turned out to be barren, worthless. I don't know what kind of cursed feet you walked in here with, but even after you came, this brothel didn't flourish. Usually when a girl as young and beautiful as you arrives, the place thrives for days. But you brought nothing but bad luck." Durdana hastily packed my belongings, forced me into a car, and sent me away. I didn't know who had bought me or what lay ahead. The car started moving, and for the second time in my life, I was on a journey. The first time I had thought I was going to meet my mother. This time I knew I was headed toward misfortune. I was being sent to live the rest of my life with a stranger, someone who could treat me however they pleased. I was terrified. The man in the car wore a mask over his face. Even in the gathering, he had been masked, so I couldn't recognize him. When we reached a flat, he led me inside. Once there, he removed his mask, and I felt the ground slip out from under me. I recognized him instantly. He was Zahir, my late father's friend. He had been a frequent visitor to our house during my childhood, but after my father's death, he had disappeared from our lives. Zahir glanced at me briefly, then threw a shawl over my shoulders and said, "Put on something appropriate." In shock, I asked, "Zahir, uncle, what are you doing here?" He replied calmly, "Tabassum, do as I say quickly. We need to leave this place, but first you need to fix yourself up." I quickly went to the bathroom, washed my face, and changed into a simple shalwar kameez. I removed all the jewelry and the sari, leaving them behind. When I stepped out, Zahir uncle was waiting. He led me back to the car and said, "I'm taking you to your home, to your mother." Hearing my mother's name, tears welled up in my eyes. Zahir uncle said, "Your mother cries for you every day. She prays to God to protect your dignity and keep you safe. She's been so worried about you. I've been searching for you for quite some time on her behalf, but I couldn't find any trace of you. Then I learned that your uncle sold you to a brothel. It was only by God's mercy and your mother's prayers that, despite being there for so long, you remained unharmed." Listening to him, I sobbed and said, "But my mother never loved me. Why would she cry for me? She was the one who handed me over to my aunt." Zahir uncle let out a heavy sigh and replied, "A mother never distances herself from her child out of choice. She does so out of necessity. You were young, and you needed care and resources that your mother couldn't provide at the time. She gave you to your aunt, hoping you'd have a better future. But soon after, she realized her mistake. Your uncle didn't let your mother meet you. She visited your aunt's house several times to see you, but each time she was turned away at the door. Then your aunt and uncle quietly moved to a different home, and your mother lost all contact with you. That's when she understood the gravity of her mistake. She was devastated and spent every day worrying about you, but she didn't know where to find you. I had gone abroad after your father's death, so I also lost touch with your family. But 2 months ago, when I returned, your mother told me everything. How your aunt and uncle mistreated you and took you far away. That's when I started searching for you. Eventually, I found your aunt's new address. When I confronted your uncle, He was intoxicated and admitted to selling you to a brothel months ago. Hearing this shocked me to my core. Your uncle didn't give me the exact address of the brothel, so it took me some time to find you. I even had to bribe him to get the information. Thankfully, I was able to reach you in time, and it's truly a miracle that your dignity and honor remained intact. When I heard that no customer ever bought you, I was sure it was because of your mother's prayers. She prayed day and night for your protection, and God answered her prayers. Your mother's only fault was that she wanted to save you from hunger and poverty. But she made a grave mistake by trusting your aunt. The entire journey, Zahir uncle kept telling me about my mother. By the time we reached home, I was filled with longing and regret. As soon as I saw my mother, I ran to her, sobbing uncontrollably, and clung to her. All the bitterness I held toward her melted away. The lies my uncle had told me, that my mother and sisters had died, were shattered. They were alive, and they had been worried sick about me. Thanks to Zahir uncle's efforts, we were reunited. I started living with my mother and sisters again. Life wasn't easy. We all worked hard in people's homes to earn a living. We ate simple meals, but we lived with dignity. I was deeply grateful for Zahir uncle's kindness and help. He not only found me and reunited me with my family, but also filed a police report against my uncle. My uncle was arrested and held accountable for his actions. I realized how powerful a mother's prayers can be. It was my mother's prayers that had protected me and guided me back to her. Although we didn't have much, we had each other, and that was enough.